I'm so glad that you've tuned in to one of the sermons from St Mary's. If you're new to our church and would like to find out more about being involved, please visit our website and drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you.
Our reading this morning is taken from Luke chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. Now, in chapter 12, Jesus had been addressing the crowds about uncomfortable truths at the same time as encouraging his disciples. Let's hear Jesus speak now about the mystery of suffering. At that very time, there were some present who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. He asked them, "Do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all other Galileans? No, I tell you. But unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. Do you think they were worse offenders than all the other people living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you. But unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Bev, thank you very much for reading for us, a slightly complicated and challenging reading. And that's because if you're landing into St Mary's this week, we're starting a sermon series that is looking at some of the difficult and challenging questions. Suffering is certainly one of those questions. And we're certainly going to find the next few moments perhaps full of different challenges as we think about the question of suffering. We want it to be challenging, but we don't want it to be uncomfortable. And so if you would like some time out space, there's a reception down there if children need changing or get uncomfortable at all, equally as Juliet has pointed out for us, there's a space down here with some carpet and some books and those types of things. And equally, there's a loo at the back. The question of suffering, the question particularly that we're looking at this morning is, does the bad news of suffering have the last word, or is there a better story? And we need to acknowledge that actually life is a complex mosaic, isn't it? Actually, this question of suffering is probably something that we might ask ourselves relatively frequently, which is why we're addressing it in church this morning. But actually, all of that sits alongside times of really great joy that we love sharing together, the joy of new life as we're giving thanks to God for Teddy's life this morning, the joy that we get to celebrate with Polly and Greg, and we're really looking forward to celebrating your wedding here next year. There's so much to give thanks for in your life and your world and the world in general. As we look around here, we're grateful that we're a parish church at the heart of our neighborhood and our community, and we get to do things like this Sunday by Sunday, where the community gather together, and that we can bring people, not just from the local community, but all across the world, to be in God's presence together. There's lots and lots that we get to celebrate and to give thanks for. But we also recognize that our world is a complex and a challenging place, and that addressing complex questions is actually part of the deal of what we do as humans. Our papers, our social media news feeds, our TV programs are full so often of challenging stories, if not downright bad news stories, where so often the kind of the good news bit sort of gets shrunk to a little nugget at the end, just before we go away to our pillows and our hot chocolates, trying to remember something good to hang on to. We recognize that family Sundays of joy quite often sit side by side with marathon Mondays of complexity. And so actually, what does it look like to be in this joyful space? but actually to do it in a way which has some kind of resonance with what life might look like for us 24/7. And what I love about Jesus in the Bible is that he doesn't duck the awkward questions. He doesn't duck reality. His teaching was full of celebration and new life, but equally, it was full of what was going on in the world day by day. Luke chapter 13, which you might like to have open in front of you. We're going to talk about it quite a bit this morning. There's a Bible in front of you. And if nothing else, you can sort of fall asleep as you're looking down at a Bible, which sort of like is way less embarrassing than nodding off. But anyway, if it helps, do have a Bible open in front of you. It's page 84. Slightly confusingly, our Bibles restart the numbering when they get through to the New Testament. And so page 84 is the page 84 at the end of the Bible rather than at the beginning. And we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke and chapter 13. So page 84, Luke chapter 13, and this is about as contemporary and as social media news feedy as Jesus gets. Luke was a great historian. Secular and Christian historians who have read this material have all commented on just what a good historian Luke was. He references plenty of contemporary events. He references lots of historical detail. But this is about as journalistic as we get. You can imagine that this is what was happening in Jesus's world that week as he was being asked this question. Luke starts off chapter 13 by saying, at that very time. It's sort of the Luke equivalent of saying news just in. He says that the events that were making the news that day were that there was a massacre that had been perpetrated by Pontius Pilate. You might remember he is the Roman governor when Jesus gets executed. And he'd massacred plenty of worshippers in their place of worship. The Roman leader of occupying forces belligerently and callously ordering the mass murder of innocent people in their place of worship might seem slightly resonant with Ukraine at the moment. Then he mentions another accident after it. He says a tower in Siloam has just fallen on 18 people and sadly caused their deaths. A tragic local accident, in my mind, particularly was drawn to the sad deaths at the Wessex water plant about 18 months ago, local deaths in the community through what seemed like a tragic workplace accident and set of circumstances. Let's just pause there and remind ourselves of what we might already know before we get stuck into the rest of it. Our church and our faith is where we bring our moments of celebration. We do it locally, we do it nationally. St. Paul's a few weeks ago to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee. And that is really great. But churches are also the places, along with our faith, where we bring our big questions as well. Church isn't just a place that we come to on Sunday for joy and party. It's also a place that we come to 24/7 with the pain of Monday as well. People are sometimes surprised that we can ask God questions. They might kind of say, well, if he's God, won't he only get a bit annoyed with me asking my questions? The reality is that God cares about our questions so much that Jesus came to be with this group of people to answer their complex questions in the everyday news of their lives. So we can say what we like to Jesus, just like this crowd did. We can come to him with our celebrations and our joy, but we can equally come to him with our questions. We can sit there and we can shout at him. We can sit there where we don't know what to say and allow the tears to speak for themselves. Jesus and God encompass and allow it and welcome it all. And there's a book in the middle of the Bible called Psalms, which if you haven't read Psalms, read it through. It's full, basically, of people shouting their questions at God and God responding. Jesus doesn't duck reality. Secondly, Jesus challenges a misunderstanding in this passage. If you have a look down at verses 2 and 4, you'll see what I mean. It's not just a common misunderstanding in Jesus' time, it's actually quite a common misunderstanding today as well. Jesus says in verses 2 and 4, do you think these people suffered in this way because they were somehow morally worse than other people? Is God punishing people somehow through suffering? To which Jesus' answer is a flat and a definite no. And if we pause to think about it, the answer in our minds, where we're being logical and perhaps not blown around by the trials of suffering in our own lives, is we see that many seemingly bad people often seem to have very comfortable lives, whereas many seemingly very good people can often have really difficult lives. So it doesn't make logical sense to conclude that suffering is somehow God punishing us for what we've done wrong. The fact that the name Jesus literally means God saves. The fact that Jesus came to earth all the way from heaven to save us shows just how much God is concerned about our questions and how his desire is not to punish us, but to save us. And that's an important thing for us to draw out, I think, for us today as well. There are some worldviews today, some actual major faiths around the world. Perhaps it's even our view as well, which would say that we suffer because God is somehow directly annoyed at us, and so we suffer in proportion to our wrongdoing. That's not what Jesus says here. He says the reality is much more nuanced. I wonder if you saw in verses 2 and 4 what Jesus precisely said. He asked whether those who suffered were worse sinners or worse offenders to other people. And he said, no, they weren't, i.e., the implication of that statement is that in some way, we all get things wrong and we all mess up. Suffering is the visible sign that the world is a broken place, and we all contribute in one way or another to that brokenness, and we experience the brokenness of suffering in our own lives. Part of that brokenness is that suffering which is just indiscriminate and chaotic. We often find ourselves saying, it's so unfair. But the good news is that God's desire is to save us from it, not to punish us through it. And that brings us to our last point, just as we look at this passage briefly this morning. We've seen that Jesus doesn't duck reality. We've seen that he challenges a common misunderstanding. And finally, we see that Jesus offers hope. He goes about it in a slightly odd way. Did you see in verses 3 and 5? He says, repent, or you will all perish, which doesn't, to be perfectly honest, seem the best way about communicating good news at the end of this particular story. But actually, I wonder if what he's saying there is actually the supreme expression of a father's love. A couple of weeks ago, I was visiting some friends, Matt and Alice, who have just become parents themselves of twin boys. So there's another Theodore and Albert, and I went to visit this new family. I'd visited them quite a while ago, but now the home is completely transformed. It's all at stair gates, and it's very, very watchful parental eyes thinking, where are Albert and Theodore at the moment? And if Albert and Theodore happen to be heading towards danger and in the wrong direction, there's always a parental arm or a parental voice that says, turn back, turn around, come back to my loving arms and to safety. The baptism service this morning made quite a lot of the word repent. And certainly that word comes up in our passage here in verses 3 and 5. It's a Bible word which literally means turn around. If you wanted to expand it a bit, it means turn around and come back to the loving Father's arms. We recognize that the world is a broken place and that it's so full of bad news. And quite often, I can be a perpetrator of bad news as well as a victim of bad news. But what Jesus says in those words is turn around. Come back to the safety of God's arms. Come back to be forgiven for our own brokenness that disfigures the world and disfigures creation. And come back to be strengthened by his Spirit, to live life differently, reflecting the glory of God. That's not just a little piece of good news at the end of life's program. That's good news for the here and now. It's God saying, I want to save you so much that I'm going to die for the bad that you do on the cross. In fact, I'm going to name my son, Jesus, God saves. His baptism. I'm going to remind you that I am with him because I want to save you. And I want to save you here and now from the sin that you carry at this moment. But equally, I want to walk with you through the complexities of life. That doesn't mean to say that everything is going to magically get better. People around you are still not going to follow me themselves. They're still going to do bad things, and that'll have an impact on you. You're equally not going to be perfect either. You're not going to be transformed overnight. Theodore is not suddenly going to become the perfect child. But actually, Jesus says, I will walk with you by my Spirit to help you to change in how you live life. But equally, I'm going to be with you to remind you of the forgiveness and the loving arms of the Father when you're going the wrong way. At the end of many of our TV news programs, there's the really helpful bit that comes on the screen that says, if you've been affected by any of the issues in this program, please call the action line. What we love to do as a church staff and a church family here is to talk. We don't just offer a telephone service, although we do offer that. Carrie and Rachel are here this morning who are in the office, and quite often we take phone calls from people who are wanting to chat to somebody, but quite often we do exciting things like go for coffees and walk around the Downs and kind of chat to people as we're walking and talking. And so if you've been affected by any of the issues in this sermon, 12 minutes or so isn't an awful lot of time to address the question of suffering. But if it's raised more questions for you, or if there's something that you'd like to chat about, then please do either contact the church office or email us via the website, and we'd love to chat further.